Okay, so we'll
Here is Karen's hand.
oh, good. Okay. So we'll go ahead and get started. I just wanted to thank you so much for coming today to our forum to discuss the recent political protests and political unrest in Egypt. This forum is the first in a series of forums that the political science program has developed to discuss current political issues and events sort of as they arise. So I just wanted to thank the Office of Student Life for their gracious support, for the refreshments, helping to organize the room, and their support for this program. Today we have Professor Peter Schwab, Professor Karen Kramer, and Shamim Abbas, all political science faculty members at Purchase College. And they're going to just place some of the recent events in sort of context, discuss some of the implications of the political unrest for the rest of the Middle East and the Arab world at large. And then they're just going to give some short presentations so we can have plenty of time for question and answers and discussion. So first I'd just like to introduce them, and then they all have some short presentations for us. So Professor Peter Schwab is a professor of political science at Purchase College, and he teaches many courses, one of them being the Middle East, which deals with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He also teaches U.S. foreign policy since 1945, which of course has much to do with the present issue that we're discussing today. He has published extensively on the role of U.S. and international politics in various regions of the world, particularly in the areas of Africa, Cuba, and human rights. Professor Karen Kramer has been teaching at Purchase College since 2000. She currently teaches courses on the Middle East, Middle Eastern politics and economics, as well as courses in comparative politics, international relations, democratization, and political economy. As a Middle East specialist, Professor Kramer was executive editor of the Middle East Report prior to coming to Purchase. She has published in leading scholarly journals and frequently provides analysis on the Middle East for political risk consultancies, private sector clients, think tanks, and research and policy organizations. And she also frequently writes on the region for leading international publications. Professor Shamim Abbas currently teaches at Political Science in the Gender Studies program and the Political Science program. She was invited to teach at the college through the Scholars at Risk program in 2005. Prior to joining Purchase College, she taught in the Department of English at the University of Texas at Austin, where she was based since 2000. Professor Abbas has additionally taught in Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. A major part of her academic career was spent with the Open University in Islamabad, where she worked with American and British consultants during the Cold War period when Western countries were combating Soviet forces in Afghanistan. She developed English language courses and language planning policies for the Pakistan government during the period 1981 to the year 2000. So I believe Professor Kramer, you're going to go first. Professor of Political Science and Gender Studies at Purchase College.
Thank you, everybody, for coming out to attend this event, and thank you so much, Professor Karen Baird, for organizing it for all of us. I think the first question that we're all asking is, where did all this come from? This Tunisian government going down, Egypt in an uproar, and how could we all have been caught so flat-footed by it? Because we were. Nobody saw this coming. Washington didn't see it. The Arab governments themselves didn't see it. I don't think the Arab people saw it. They're, I think, as stunned as the rest of us. And certainly us scholars and analysts who've been working and studying and observing the region for decades, and I include myself in that, did not predict the events that we're seeing right now. Certainly we all knew that there was a tremendous amount of discontent among the Arab citizenry. These are populations that were demoralized, disgruntled, unhappy at corrupt and repressive and thuggish governments that had left a horrific record of economic mismanagement behind them. So, everybody knew that people weren't happy, but the regimes seemed very secure. And indeed, their longevity attests to that. Most of the regimes in the Arab world have been there for decades. But humans are unpredictable, and that's why political science is not a science, it's an art. And there was a spark, and the spark came in Tunisia. And this was a fruit and vegetable vendor who set himself on fire, killed himself in rage and despair over having his cart thing taken away from him because he didn't have, by some low-level government worker, because he didn't have the necessary permit. And for some reason, this act of rage and desperation touched Tunisians deeply, and it sparked something. And we saw the Tunisians come out in the street, big time, and register their rage and their despair and their anger over a corrupt and thuggish and repressive system. Now, it could have played out very differently. It could have ended there. It didn't, because the Tunisian military didn't stand behind the Tunisian president, Ben Ali. And this no one foresaw. The military abandoned Ben Ali. We didn't expect this because of the sense that these regimes have been so secure for primarily two reasons. There's two pillars of security for these authoritarian regimes. One of them has been traditionally a very effective, loyal security apparatus. An apparatus that is well fed by the state, in other words, substantial benefits, economic and financial benefits are funneled into this military, and they stay loyal to the regime, and they stand ready and able and willing to squash any opposition or challenge to the regime. The other pillar of security is a patronage system whereby economic benefits are allocated out throughout society in a more concentrated way to the elite segments of society that the regime feels it needs to be secure, but even trickling down to the masses on a more minimal level, on a more subsistence level, but at least maintaining economic dependency on the state for things like government jobs, subsidies, and so forth. So this system of patronage and repression had seemed to keep everything locked in. But in Tunisia, the military did not stand behind Ben Ali. Why is that? We now learn that the corruption and the greed was so great by Ben Ali and his family that evidently they didn't take care of the constituencies that they needed. They didn't co-opt the segments of society that they needed, and they certainly hadn't taken well care enough of their military, who was similarly disgusted with the regime, and they did not stand behind it. That's the critical turning point. Once your military goes, the party's over. Because at the end of the day, what are these authoritarian regimes going to rely on? They're going to rely on their security apparatus, their organs of repression, to squash dissent. Ben Ali didn't have that. It was over. He fled the country. That was the other critical turning point, because seeing a sitting president in the Arab world have to flee the country, this was unprecedented. And I don't know how else to put it except to use the cliche that this somehow broke the wall of fear that seems to have characterized the Arab world. And apparently, Egyptians were looking at this, as many others in the Arab world, and saying, you know what? If they can do it, if Tunisia can do it, why can't we? Why are we still living under these corrupt, repressive thugs? We have to take a stand too. That wall of fear was broken, and that changed the whole equation. It irrevocably changed the political landscape of the Arab world, I believe. Now, unexpectedly, huge numbers of Egyptians took to the streets to protest their regime. And again, another key point. The Egyptian military decided not to fire on their unarmed civilians. I believe that there was a different dynamic involved here. I think that in Tunisia, the military had no longer aligned itself with the regime. I think in Egypt, the dynamic was more that this was a huge number of protesters that came out in Tahrir Square. And I think there was uncertainty on the part of the upper echelons of the military, whether or not the rank and file would carry out orders to mow down this amount of people. That's very, very stressful for a military to have to slaughter, basically, their own citizens in large numbers. It has been done. You know, the famous example we always refer to of Hama, the Syrian city, where the former president of Syria, Hafez al-Assad, had basically reduced that city to rubble and 10,000 people in it, because it was increasingly a hotbed of dissent. But this is not something that any regime likes to do. It's dangerous, it's tricky, it's expensive, it's ugly, and you have to make sure that your rank and file is going to carry it out. And I think there was doubt, or at least uncertainty on this. And so the military in Egypt did something very smart. They stood back and they said, well, we're going to bide our time and see how this plays out. We're going to maintain our neutrality, because the ultimate, I think the ultimate objective was we have to preserve our own power. Mubarak, with Mubarak, without Mubarak, we have to preserve our power. So where are we now? I think increasingly we're seeing signs that are very distressing to observers who are hoping for some real change here. That the military is successfully maneuvering to hold on to power. Even if Mubarak is out, and of course he says he's not going to stand for election in the next presidential elections in September, his interior minister, Suleiman, seems to be pledging to shepherd the country through this transition. If you ask me, that's a little bit like the foxes guarding the hen house, but who knows, stranger things have happened. They are maneuvering, they are indicating, at least they're giving initial signs, that they do not wish to go very fast and far down this reform road. They may have U.S. acquiescence in this. Why? Why is that? Because the United States has a dilemma. I think the United States ideally would like to promote democracy. I think in an ideal world we do stand for democracy. But we also have strategic interests, and we have strategic allies. These authoritarian Arab countries, more often than not, are strategic allies of ours. They work with us combating international terror groups. They're moderates on the Arab-Israeli front, Egypt and Jordan, the two countries that have signed peace treaties with Israel. They afford us important strategic assets like military bases. They are important allies. We don't want to lose that. And the harsh truth that the United States is painfully aware of is that any representative government, any more representative government in the Arab world is going to be less amenable to working with U.S., to cooperating with the U.S. and meeting our strategic interests. It's simply not the popular will. It's been the governments and the military. We work closely with them. We give them a lot of aid, but it's not the popular will. And a more popularly represented government is going to reflect that. So that's the dilemma that the United States has to, the line that it has to walk. The other concern that the United States has is destabilizing other allies in the region. It's not just about Egypt. There's signs of serious rumbling in many other Arab countries, many of whom, they're authoritarian countries, but they're our allies. We don't want to be seen as throwing in the towel and tipping the scales against these guys, because we kind of want, we feel, right or wrong, that we kind of want them and kind of need them too. So there's a dilemma there, and I think that explains some of the contradictory messages that the U.S. is putting out at this point, because it's a difficult line to walk. If there is going to be a democratic transition in Egypt, or even movement towards it, there's going to need to be very significant political reforms on a very deep institutional level. And if you're interested, and we can get into that in the Q&A, but it will require very serious reforms and measures to change what the system as it is now. Whether or not that would happen under this, what looks like to be shaping up this transitional kind of vehicle, I don't know. A lot will depend on, do the protesters have the staying power? A lot will depend on, will the United States continue to put the pressure on? We have tremendous leverage over Egypt. We give them a huge amount of aid. Will we press them for more significant reform, or will we stand back and try to minimize any damage? Will the priority be to minimize any damage to our strategic interests? I don't know yet. If they do the latter, I would argue that we're probably just kicking the can down the road. There's going to be upheaval subsequently then. The other piece of that, I think, is the U.S. is going to have to decide to accept a little bit less if we're willing to go down that road of reform. Like a friend of mine just said to me, half a loaf is better than no bread at all. We're going to have to accept relations with these countries that are not as close if we're going to be willing to move down this road of reform. But we can talk about that more in the Q&A. Lastly, regional implications. Truth be told, it's unclear. Nobody really knows yet how this is going to play out in the region. Deep rumblings in terms of the Arab world. Deep rumblings in many other Arab countries. People are clearly worried about Jordan and Yemen. Signs of unrest in other countries as well. They could stabilize. A lot will depend on how it plays out in Egypt. Everybody's watching. Will the protesters keep going? How will the U.S. play it? What's going to happen here? Is the regime, basically, even if Mubarak's out, is it going to ostensibly remain intact and kind of slide through? I think that the way this plays out will affect significantly regional ramifications. So I think that that's too early to call in terms of what other countries are going to go down or stay up. I would say, if I was advising Washington, and I'll just close with this remark, that while we don't know how anything's going to play out at this point, they certainly better be doing some serious contingency planning. And because I think we're in for quite a ride at this point. And I'll close there and we'll continue.
Our last speaker, Professor Peter Schwab.
People think that I'm pessimistic, but you are more so. I'm going to speak about, I guess, something a little different here. The issue of foreign policy, the issue of what we can expect and what we might expect. There are obviously two models here. One is the Iranian model, which you spoke of, but the other Iranian model is a response to the election of some years ago, in which the military came down very hard, obviously, and crushed the dissidents. The other model, of course, is the Philippines, where Marcos was thrown out, Aquino did take over, and you had a sort of democratic result. There are multiple models here. There are also models that the United States has been leery of. The Iranian model, the Castro model, where we lose control. We really can't control things. The question remains, what might happen now? I think the first thing I would like to say is that the longer this goes on, the greater the tendency for real chaos and violence here. If one of the sides loses patience, particularly the side with the guns, this could have a very sort of tragic conclusion to it. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but the longer it goes on, there is really great potential here. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. We're talking about a military, the moment that is, of course, neutral, is played neutrally. The question is, what will the leadership of the military do? And that's what I'm going to get into. I think the issue of Mubarak is secondary. He may leave office tomorrow, obviously to great acclaim of the opposition, and he may try to hold out until September, which appears more and more unlikely. I think the tensions that are taking place here may cause his allies, particularly the new Vice President and Prime Minister, to try to force him out. Whatever happens, I think the military and the security forces, which are now in some ways running Egypt via the new Vice President Suleiman, which has held power since 1952, since the Nasser Revolution. The military has controlled Egypt for that entire time. In 1970, when Nasser had a heart attack, Sadat took over. By 1973, he had thrown the Soviets out. He initiated the 73 war, which was a great political success, which then, of course, led to the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty. But the fact is, the Egyptian military and security forces have been in control not just for his 30 years, but 20 years prior to that. If Mubarak leaves, I think it's likely that this new military elite, or this group run by Suleiman, will negotiate with the opposition. And they will retain authority. Even if elements of the opposition negotiate and get open, transparent elections, an end to the state of emergency, a greater democratization, and a sort of relinquishing of the dictatorial obvious authority, I think the military and the security under this vice president, at least in the short term, will retain control. I think there are, however, two elephants in the room here. One is the United States. Whatever one may think in Tahrir Square or in Cairo as to the role of the United States, the role of the United States is very important. We have great, as you pointed out, great national interests and national security interests in the Middle East. And this is the primary concern of the United States. Any great power bases its policy not on morality, not on what they, sound good, but what is in the national interest of the United States. And it is clear from what we have heard from Clinton and Obama that the key word is stability. And I want to talk about what stability really means here. Stability is primary, and if necessary, Mubarak will continue his term of office if stability is seen as important vis-a-vis he. But I don't think that's the case. I think stability for the United States is key, even if Mubarak leaves office tomorrow. What is stability to the United States? Egypt must remain, for the United States' position, among the conservative Entente of states, which includes Egypt, Israel, Jordan, United Arab Emirates, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, which the United States is trying to use, and these countries themselves are trying to use, to balance the radical states in the Arab and Muslim, or Muslim world, such as Iran, Syria, Hamas in Gaza, and Hezbollah in Lebanon. That means the United States is going to want to keep Egypt under as a client state, under its rubric, which it has had really as a client state since the end of the '73 war, but certainly after the 1979 treaty. It means also, security means not permitting the Tunis contagion to subvert a pro-West Egypt, which has been that way, as I said, since 1979, and then to have it spread to another important conservative state in the region, which is Jordan. The problem with Jordan is 60% of Jordanians are Palestinians, West Bankers. 40% are tribal, the Hashemite leadership. It's a minority. And King Abdullah has to be very, very careful, and the United States is greatly concerned about that Palestinian situation, Palestinian population. Both Egypt and Jordan are mainstays of the U.S. position in the Arab world and mainstays of the U.S.-Israeli policy and U.S. policy in Israel itself. Those two states are key to the second elephant in the room, which is Israel. And the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty of 1979. In 1979, Israel relinquished the Sinai Peninsula. In return, it basically got two things. The Egyptian army, of course, left Sinai, so Israel no longer had to worry about a war among the frontline states. Syria and Jordan and Lebanon could not conduct a war without Egypt. On the other hand, it allowed Begin, who was prime minister, and future prime ministers, to virtually have a free hand to do whatever they wanted to the Palestinians in the West Bank, since Israel no longer had to keep troops, or the bulk of troops, in southern Israel. That gave Israel a free hand. It no longer had to worry about a major frontline war, on its borders. Now, Israel after 1979 used that free hand. In 1982, it invaded Lebanon. And it invaded Lebanon in an attempt to finally, as Begin said, destroy the Palestinian movement. Didn't finally destroy it, but it certainly put a crink into it. Now, for the United States to have Egypt in the hands of even a sort of traditional figure like Mohammed el-Baradei, who was one of the key figures being involved here, or any of the leaders of the revolt, without an Egyptian military presence to contain them, would, as the U.S. sees it, I would argue, threaten or potentially threaten the maintenance of the treaty between Egypt and Israel. Should that treaty be called into question, or even seen to be in question, even if it's not called into question, it would curtail any interest in Israel, or among Israelis, to continue to pursue peace with the Palestinian Authority insofar as they've been pursuing it at all. I.e., if the Egyptian treaty might be in question, then peace with a divided Palestinian entity, with Hamas controlling the West Bank and the U.S. in opposition to it, even though it was one of the U.S. pushed the elections for it, and Fatah, the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, would be far less likely that Israel is going to do any negotiation if, in fact, the treaty that has been there for 30 years is now being called into question. I think you can rest assured that if Egypt is seen as tentative, even if it doesn't conclude tentatively, Israel is not going anywhere with any negotiation, no matter how much the U.S. tries to pressure it. Israel will see itself, if that happens, in isolation in the Middle East, which would further isolation in the Middle East, if they have to worry about Jordan and they have to worry about Egypt. And therefore, I think that they would take a very hardline position, particularly since what happened in terms of their response, how they responded to the attempt to break the blockade of Gaza, and became even intenser relationship with Turkey, if you will. Thus, I would argue that all these political layers indicate that though Egypt will certainly be changed radically as a result of this extraordinary rebellion, the question is, will the U.S. and the Egyptian military and security leadership, now led by this new vice president and prime minister, contain the change? Will they be able to contain the change? Or will the faces of change, as we see in the square and elsewhere, overwhelm the conservatism of Obama and Clinton and of the Egyptian elite? In essence, can the U.S. have Mubarak evicted from power while supporting the Egyptian military via Soleimani, and still be seen as supporting the push for democracy as witnessed in Liberation Square? That, I think, is what the United States is trying to accomplish, and it's questionable whether we'll be able to do it, but I think that is what it's trying to do at the moment. It's trying to please all the parties, and I don't think it's going to be able to do it, particularly if you listen to the people in the square who become more and more alienated with Obama and Clinton's saying, we want democracy now, and then a day later backing up from that. So the United States has multiple layers here. Israel is heavily involved, not directly, but in terms of what will happen vis-a-vis Egypt in relationship to Israel. And then, of course, Egypt as really the most important Arab state in the region, in and of itself, is vital in terms of U.S. national interest. So I think if you put all of that together, it becomes something that's not predictable. You can't predict it. Nobody knows what will happen in the final result. But I think the United States will do everything that it can to try to ensure that the Egyptian security service, force, and military maintain authority, not full control, over whatever forces it's forced to negotiate with as a result of this rebellion. Thanks.